Well, thank you. Now let's see, got it. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And of course, thanks to Elena for organizing and inviting me to talk to you all today. So I'll be giving you a little bit of a guide, I suppose, to the academic job search. But before I get to that, let me just give a shout out to my lab and to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Hopkins, and you can learn more about my lab at jeff.works as our lab website. But broadly speaking, we're interested in how RNAs are organized in the cell and also how cells are organized within tissues and how this spatial contextual organization impacts cellular function and cellular phenotype, particularly during developmental processes. So we develop computational methods for analyzing big data, and we contribute to open source software for the bioinformatics community. And let's see. Okay, so before we get into things, I just wanted to set some expectations since, you guys are coming into this talk. I think the goal of this talk is not to give you advice on what it takes to quote unquote succeed in the academic job search, or what it takes to obtain a research intensive STEM position. But rather, my goal for this talk is to provide you with an anecdote of my academic job search and a reflection of what I think worked for me and the factors that impacted my decision making. So I think we should all be in some ways wary of how survivorship bias might bias and distort our views on what it takes to be successful, and subsequently on who's given a voice and offering career advice. So please do take everything I say with a grain of salt. Okay, so first, just to give you a little bit about me and provide you a little bit of context, because I think it's important to ground everything I say and the subsequent advice I'm about to give in me as a specific person, so that you can judge for yourself, which aspects you identify with and which aspects, may not apply to you. And, if it's some things, then great. If it's none of these things apply to you, that's perfectly fine too. So just as a brief background about me, I was born in China in a rural part of what has now become a bustling city of Wuhan. So this is me on the right with my grandma at the Great Wall of China. I moved to the US when I was about 6 years old. So in that sense, I am a first generation immigrant. However, I became naturalized as a citizen as a teenager due to my parents becoming naturalized citizens. So in that sense, I have a very limited experience with the visa and immigration system from the adult perspective. And I also likely don't have a great appreciation for how this visa system impacts the job search, but just as a heads up. Okay, so I did my undergrad at Hopkins from 2009 to 2013. This is our dorm photo, Sylvester. I'm in the middle here. But I studied actually biomedical engineering and applied math when I was an undergrad here. And I was fortunate enough to go through undergrad with very limited student debt, which will become important in my decision-making later. So during undergrad, I interned in the Karchin lab with Rachel Karchin to contribute to the lab's work on mutation functional impact prediction. And I think through that experience, I was able to just hang out with a lot of amazing women, strong women in science. And likewise, Rachel herself has a very, I would characterize it as a non-linear path towards academia. So if you ever get a chance to speak with her on it, she's a great role model. And during undergrad, I founded actually, I took business law on campus. I was one of these, as an elective, it's like a 8 p.m. course on campus. I took this business law class, and through the business law class, I learned how to, establish a LLC, all these other business type structures. And I founded my photography company, J Photography, which I had been doing photography as a hobby for a while, but formalizing it as a company, I think, gave me some experience in what it took to do this, and likewise allowed me to form certain relationships with licensing companies that would take my photos and license them to be used on book covers, as shown on the right. So that was some of the hobbies I did. And then taking some of these skills that I learned through my photography, I became the head of Thoroughfare magazine on campus. And I led us to kind of ditch some of the older technologies that were being used and move kind of us online to use some of the same resources that I saw that were being used in the professional photography and magazine distribution industry. And I think through that experience of heading Thoroughfare magazine, I also gained some skills in managing people and just seeing what it took to create institutional or structural change in an organization, even if that organization is very small. And during my, I think, junior year in undergrad, I was fortunate enough to be introduced through Rachel to this research for undergraduate experience at Harvard Medical School in bioinformatics and integrative genomics. So that was a fun time. It was a summer program where I went up to Boston and did research in Shamil Sunyev's lab at Harvard. And it also gave me a chance to just explore the Boston area and get to begin establishing some friendships and mentors in the Harvard Medical School community. So then, I liked it so much that I actually went back there for my PhD. So I did my PhD in the same program where I did my RU experience, and I rotated with a couple different labs and eventually joined the lab of Peter Karchenko on the right here. So Peter was a postdoc actually at the time when I rotated with him. And I rotated with him because I initially wanted to rotate in his former mentor's lab, Peter Park's lab, but Peter Park was in Korea for the summer and he wasn't available. So he pointed me to this aspiring young postdoc who was about to start his own lab, and I joined Peter's lab, and I really enjoyed it. He was actually my first rotation, and I rotated with other labs and eventually decided to go back and join Peter's lab. So this is one of our happy hours where, one of the skills I developed through, I suppose, doing art was how to Photoshop things. So I like to Photoshop him onto this is Putin on a bear. But anyways, we had a lot of fun, and our lab did develop computational methods for analyzing single cell transcriptomics data and multi-omics data. And it was a pretty new and burgeoning field at the time, which recently in 2019, many years afterwards, was finally single cell multi-omics was recognized as a method of the year. So in that sense, we were a bit ahead of the curve. But because it was a very hot, new burgeoning field, I think it was very fortuitous, and therefore I was able to publish my work in many, top tier journals such as Nature Methods, and also one of the art skills I developed, during my hobbies, I was able to integrate into designing covers now for these scientific journals as well. So it was a fun time. And also, I guess during Harvard, during my time at Harvard, I became the co-chair of the Harvard Graduate Women in Science and Engineering program. And through that, it exposed me to, of course, surrounded me with other very ambitious and talented women in science, and provided me with various role models. But it also, I think, gave me a lot of resources to do fun things and organize fun events. So one of the events that I organized was this Wise Beyond Your Years symposium, which was the 10-year anniversary symposium, which initially I think I wasn't confident enough to make it such a large event. But then Margot Gill, who was the dean at the time, and John Pettit, who was the alumni relations director, they really pushed me to make the event bigger and allowed us to make it this huge event where we had a poster session and invited keynotes, and an alumni actually travel and come back, and yeah, it was a very fun time. But I think it also gave me a lot of experience in what it takes to put one of these big events together. So during my PhD, I also did a lot of volunteer teaching on the weekends. So initially I taught, in lieu of doing in lieu of TAing, I actually taught second grade girls after school at the Science Club for Girls program. And eventually I decided that I didn't want to just teach young girls a curriculum that somebody else had developed. I wanted to develop my own curriculum. So then I went to the Innovation Institute, TI2, where on weekends I taught a group of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders computer science without intimidation. So this was a curriculum I was able to develop myself, and they had a fun time. And I think one of the things that I noticed during my teaching was just that a lot of my younger female students didn't really see themselves as scientists. They didn't really, they were doing the science, but they didn't necessarily internalize that identity as being, or that potential of being a future scientist as a career choice. So I illustrated and created this children's picture storybook that I gave to them at the end of the year, that I personalized with their names and their images, so that I could show them that to essentially give them this token and gift, and leave them with this present to show that I really believe that they could be anything they wanted to be. So as a part of that, I eventually then used my computational skills to make this personalized children's storybook accessible through the internet. So any parent could come onto our website at customize.org and create a personalized storybook for their child. And eventually, I again took my kind of business skills that I got earlier on to formalize this organization as a 501c3 nonprofit. And one of the, I guess, other interesting things through my work with Customize was just that I was able to work with a lot of different people who are all remote. So Customized is run by a team of fully remote volunteers, as seen on the right here. Most of us are graduate students and or other students, but also career professionals who are interested in outreach and supporting young girls in science. So through Customized, I got some experience in terms of managing a team virtually, which was a skill that I did not anticipate would come in handy, and a skill that I think that I did very poorly earlier on, and I failed quite a number of times through Customized. I think by failing so many times through Customized, by the time I was able to establish my own lab virtually, it actually hopefully got better over time. And I did apply to a number of fellowships during my PhD. So earlier on, I applied to a NSF GRFP, and then later an F31, and later an F99. And I think writing the grants was and applying to these things was very important for me to put my ideas down in a way that others could understand. So it was an important aspect of scientific communication. But I think for me, also having that grant and having that money gave me a certain degree of entitlement to ask my professor for things that I don't know if I would have asked for if I didn't have the backing of these grants. So one of the things I asked a lot for was to travel and to give talks and to do other travel associated things. I also applied for a number of awards when I was during my PhD, which again I think allowed me to travel and essentially informally interview at all these companies. So this was the Regeneron Research Award that I and all these other people won, and it was it allowed us to travel to Regeneron and see their facilities and also just network with each other, which was a fun time. I also gave a TEDx talk during my PhD at Hopkins. So that was TEDx JHU, and I also gave quite a number of other talks, as I mentioned previously, because I had the grants and I felt entitled to travel. But I think one of the fun things about giving talks beyond, just seeing the world and meeting new people was it taught me how to communicate about my science in a way that was approachable and accessible to people outside the field. And one other thing that happened during my PhD was that the two-body problem was introduced. So I met my significant other, and he was also, finishing up school at the time. So this will come into play later in terms of my decision making for my post PhD career plans. Okay, so as I mentioned, since my significant other was finishing school in the Boston area also, by the time I graduated, he hadn't graduated. So therefore, I had to stay or I guess I had to either abandon him for a few years, or I could stay in the Boston area. And I decided to stay in the Boston area and continue with a postdoc. But at least I wanted a change of scenery, so I moved across the river to the Harvard, Maine University, where I did my postdoc. And so I did my postdoc in Xiaowei Zhuang's lab. Xiaowei's on the left here, and the lab developed spatial transcriptomics microscopy technology. So it was a microscopy lab where I was able to interact with a lot of other talented graduate students, such as Gui Ping and Leonardo, who's a talented postdoc. And I think in the lab, everyone was a bit of a jack of all trades. Everyone was, they knew some physics and they knew some chemistry and they knew some hardware and they knew some software, and they put it all together into designing these or really, innovating and building these new spatially resolved transcriptomic technologies. So then, it was also, in some ways, it allowed me to apply my computational skills to a burgeoning new field. So spatially resolved transcriptomics was actually recognized as the method of the year last year in 2020. And I think, again, because it was such a hot and burgeoning field, it allowed me to publish, our works in very top tier journals, including PNAS. This is our paper on the right. But anyways, other things that during my postdoc, I was fortunate to be in Xiaowei's lab is, a very famous lab, and there are other postdocs, of course, are very ambitious and drawn to the lab. And one of the postdocs in the lab, Jiang He, who was formerly a Forbes 30 under 30 recipient. So he nominated me to be a Forbes 30 under 30, and I was fortunate to receive that. But eventually I also learned how to advocate for myself, and I nominated myself for the Nature Research Award, which I did win my various research contributions. Last year in July 2020, I started my lab at Hopkins, this was during the middle of the pandemic, so everything was virtual, and I didn't actually get a chance to meet many of my students face to face until a few months ago or a few weeks ago. That's been a very interesting experience. So this is our lab. We develop computational methods for now analyzing spatially resolved transcriptomics data. And again, an unanticipated benefit of art skills is that I can Photoshop my lab members to being in a lab photo together, even if we're physically separated. So this is our summer lab photo with, we have high school interns in the lab now. So our lab is about a year old now. And again, because of some of my earlier exposure to grant writing, I was able to submit a couple of grants very early on during when I started my faculty position. And those grants are now just starting to trickle in. So we've been fortunate to receive support from the NSF Career Awards. And just yesterday, we received the notice of awards for our MIRA application from the NIH. And likewise, some of our methods are also now starting to become going online as either preprints or being formally published. So then in terms of, some of the lessons I think I learned through, this academic journey of mine, I think the main thing that I like to say is to try it before you buy it. I think academia or being a faculty is it's an interesting job. It's so in some ways it's a job that I think you can try various aspects of before you actually do it. So things that faculty do a lot are travel and give talks. These are things that you can do as a PhD student or a postdoc. I think it's also worth noting how diverse faculty positions are. If you are interested in the academic faculty track, some faculty positions are very teaching intensive. So if you are interested in that, I would recommend to get some experience teaching and designing courses, and maybe taking some courses in pedagogy, and actually trying to get a sense for, do you enjoy teaching before, for example, getting thrown into the deep end of being a heavy teaching style faculty. Other faculty positions have, for example, especially those at medical schools, they have very limited teaching or maybe even no teaching. And instead, most of your time will be spent on writing grants. So I think it's worth getting that experience, trying to write a grant and seeing if you enjoy that process during your training, if you're able to do that. And of course, a large component of being a faculty member and running a lab is managing people. So to the extent to which you're able to mentor a high school student or mentor an undergraduate student, those are good skills for you to try, or good things for you to try out before you dedicate many years of your life to this particular career. I think other lessons I've learned is just to don't underestimate the value of a social capital. So that is, it doesn't necessarily mean to have lots of very strong connections. Even having lots of tangential or weak connections with different people is valuable. So, being able to find mentors and learning how to really convert them into advocates, and then later to sponsors to support you and the ambitions that you have, I think is important. And of course, learning to advocate somewhat shamelessly for yourself. and also your community are valuable skills. And I think one, perhaps something that I try to keep in mind is to not let my identity be defined by my work. So, we are all complex and, many multifaceted people. We have hobbies, and I think it's important to have those hobbies and, be able to say that, for example, even on days where, experiments fail, where my code doesn't run, everything work-wise is doing poorly or crashing down, I can still say that, at least I bake very good cookies or something, so that I have other aspects that I can, about myself, I can feel good about on those days. But then, I think it's also important to develop a set of core values that guide your work process or your decision making, because at the end of the day, I think it's especially as a faculty, nobody tells you what to do. You have to tell yourself what to do, and you have to tell students what to do. So I think having and developing that set of core values, whatever they might be, is important to having that sense of guiding direction. And then lastly, I think it's important to focus on skills rather than end goals. So I read an article recently that was talking about how students felt like if they didn't have a grant, they couldn't be a faculty member or something. And there's a lot of emphasis on the end goal of getting the grant. But I think what we need to focus on is the skills that come with writing the grant in the first place, and rather than necessarily getting the grant itself. However, I think it is also important to understand the meritocratic system that we exist in, and the various metrics that are being used to evaluate us. So these are metrics that we should keep in mind, but not make our end goals. So for example, I think it's important to do good science. And in theory, if you do good science, the alt metrics like the H-index, the citations, and so forth will all come along. But we still have to be at least aware that not everyone will have the time to judge our science based on its inherent value, and they're going to look at things like alt metrics for better or worse. So then for part 2, I can tell you a little bit about my post-PhD job search. So after my PhD at Harvard in bioinformatics and integrative genomics, towards the last 4 months, as I was writing my thesis, again, I think because I had my own grants, I felt entitled to take a lot of time off to travel and interview. So I did quite a bit of, essentially took 4 months off to travel and interview, both formally and informally. And by informally, I mean, I would literally go on LinkedIn and chat up a CEO of a startup and ask to meet for coffee. So a lot of my biotech, the interviews I had with biotech startups were rather informal. Most of them didn't have names yet. But I also had a good number of friends who transitioned into biotech and pharma, and also into tech and fintech. So I scheduled various meetings to speak with them before formally applying. So among the biotechs, things like Regeneron, Pfizer, Merck, and among the techs, things like Google, Facebook, and then also I considered fintech like Bloomberg and hedge funds. So again, because of my computational background, it made a little bit easier to transition into, or potentially transition into the tech and the fintech. And I had friends who were a couple of years ahead of me in the PhD program who did make that transition, despite coming from a more biological bioinformatics background. So I can say, let's see. Yeah, I think the main lessons that I had from those informal interviews and formal interviews was just to the importance of knowing your worth. And I think a part of, and I mean very much knowing your financial worth, like knowing how much value financially you bring to the company. So I think in order to get a sense of that, it's important to ask around and ask, very bluntly, how much do you make and how much should I expect to be offered for, a position if I apply. And then I think once you do get into that interview stage, it was very important for me to ask certain questions, especially for the startups. Questions such as, what is your market differentiator? You're a startup. I'm interviewing with all these other startups that are essentially doing the same thing as you. Why do you think you're going to succeed and not this other startup? Why should I bring my talents to your startup? And if they didn't have a good answer, I was not afraid to walk away. And among other tough questions that I felt like I was asking is, I insisted on them having a maternity and paternity leave policy. If a company didn't have that, it was something very important to me. So yeah, if they didn't have one, it was I thought that was kind of a what's it called, just something that I wouldn't be able to get over. Yeah, so interviewing is a two-way street, just like any long-term commitments, I suppose. So yeah, it's worth reflecting for yourself, reflecting on what is your worth and knowing what you bring to the table. So I think the other aspect that I thought was I learned from speaking with all my friends, especially those in fintech, is to know the value of independence and leisure and other non-monetary job features. So a lot of my friends who are in fintech, they were being paid, let's say mid to high six figures, but they were working just incredibly hard, and to the point where a lot of them were doing this FIRE thing, financial independence, retire early, whatever concept or lifestyle, where they knew that they were working incredibly hard for next 5 years. So that they could just retire. And it's great that they've decided to do that. I think for me, I would probably just have a heart attack and die before I reach that point. So not something for me. But I think there is legitimate value to other non-monetary job features, including things like independence, leisure, and other benefits. So yeah, I think it's important to also appreciate that these things will be different for different people. So again, take everything with a grain of salt. One thing that did come out of my various interviews, especially more formal interviews with bio, is I don't understand the point of an industry postdoc. To me, it seems like a way of underpaying highly qualified, post PhD scientists. I just don't get it. So if you are interested in biotech and industry, I would strongly suggest to just go for the scientist position rather than industry postdocs. I really don't understand their point. But eventually I did choose the postdoc route, and I think some major reasons of why I chose the postdoc route is both myself and my significant other did not come out of undergrad with significant student debt. So we had very limited financial pressure. So it was perfectly okay for me to take a lower paying job than what I could have taken. And of course, there was the two-body problem, which for me wasn't as big of a deal, I suppose, because Boston had lots of biotech. but did pose an issue for things like the Regeneron and for fintechs, since most of those were in New York. I also was interested in gaining new skills and ultimately practicing independence. So therefore, I chose to do my postdoc in a very large lab where I had kind of access to unlimited resources, but very limited mentorship. So I kind of just did my own thing. So then I did my postdoc, and I transitioned to faculty reasonably quickly within 2 years. So just to tell you a little bit about my faculty job search, I did my faculty job search within the first year of my postdoc, which was unexpected. The reason I did it was because one, I got invitations, and two, I had former mentors at Hopkins who told me that there was a position opening that they thought I would be well suited for. So I applied to a very few places, not really expecting any success. These were R1 institutions focused on life science and bioengineering programs. I was geographically limited to Boston and the DC, Maryland area, and also Chicago, because my family is from the DC area and my significant other's family is in Chicago. So I thought, well, if I'm doing an initial small run, might as well kind of aim high, and these were the places I was really interested in long term. So then in terms of my transition timeline, I would say that it's not a timeline that I recommend. It's a bit rushed. So I applied to the K99 grant at the same time, which is this grant that a lot of people get to support their transition from postdoc to faculty. Because if you get it, it provides, I think, like 3 or 4 years of funding when you transition to faculty. So you can start, your new lab with, $250K in funding support per year, which is quite nice. So I applied to that grant at the same time that I applied to, I submitted both concurrently, which in some ways was convenient. But then the issue was, I didn't realize how long grant reviews take. And the grant review took about a year. And by the time the grant was reviewed, it was actually successful. But I had already accepted a position as an assistant professor, at Hopkins, which made me ineligible to receive the grant. So it was at the time a lot of heartache. But I think in some ways, because that grant was successful but not awarded, I was able to essentially, when I started my faculty position, quickly rewrite it into the other grants that have now been funded in the lab. So the end result ended up being about the same, but it was a lot of, I guess, unnecessary stress, which I would not advise or recommend. So I think the lessons I learned from I would recommend quality over quantity. I think it takes a lot of time to apply to these positions and to really understand the institutions and the resources that are available to you at each institution. And I think compared to other postdocs in the lab who was applying at the same time as I applied for very few and was successful, whereas others applied to hundreds and I would say had an equal success rate. So then, what's the point of applying to hundreds if the final interview rate is about the same? And I think it is important to get your advisor involved. Again, this goes back to the shamelessly advocating for yourself type of thing, where essentially ask your advisor if they'd be willing to announce your search during their talks, or even I had colleagues who asked their advisors to just email and call colleagues to see if there were positions available. I think those you should be shameless in all the techniques that you use, and don't be afraid to leverage your resources, and your advisor is one of those resources. I think it's also important to publicize, especially now in the internet era. You can announce your search both during your talks, but also be present on social media. And of course, I think it's again good to try it before you buy it, especially if it's the institution is at a location you're unfamiliar with or haven't visited before. You can just ask to give a talk. In JHU, for example, for BME, we invite people to give talks all the time. So it's perfectly normal to as a postdoc to just find someone and ask if they'd be willing to host you for a talk as part of a seminar series, or what are the opportunities available to give seminars at their institution. And one thing that I was very, I guess, concerned about when I went on the job market, kind of a source for imposter syndrome, was just that I didn't have any formal publications for my postdoc. But I did have a pretty close to being kind of written up type story. So I could still say what I have been doing in my postdoc. And what I intended to do, during my facultyship. So in that sense, I think, you can go on the job market without formal publications, but it's better if it's on bioRxiv, and it's better if it's in revision, and it's better if it's in press, and it's better if it's published. But it's not by any means kind of a requirement. And again, I think in speaking with other former mentors that I had who were sitting on these search committees for faculty, they are interested in track records with grants. At least, that's what they say. That if you have a track record with grants, it's very helpful in the process. It's not required, but again, I think so much of being a faculty, especially at R1 or even medical school type research-heavy institutions, is reliant on grants. So having some familiarity with that system is definitely helpful, and demonstrating success through that system, of course, is then very helpful in your search process. And I think the last thing I'll leave you with is just this postdoc career transition timeline that I recommend to my postdocs. That if I were to have done this all over again, I would apply for the K99 in order to formalize my ideas and what I wanted to do during my facultyship, but then also get that practice of writing grants. And to wait until that grant comes in before I do a formal job application and job search. And there are, the K99 comes, there are 3 opportunities per year to apply to it. So, if you aim for one and you don't make it, it's perfectly okay to apply the next round. The challenging part of timing is that faculty positions tend to come only once a year. So that is a bit of a rate limiting step of sorts. So that you should keep in mind that applications tend to open in October, and you tend to formally get interviewed in April. So then, that tends to be a more rigid factor in the timeline. But then, for the most part, I think all of these steps and advice are just guidelines. It's perfectly okay to deviate from it. You can still be successful, without the K99 and without doing a lot of these formal things. But I think they do help. Even if you don't get the grant, I think it's helpful to formalize your ideas and to get that experience in putting a budget together. So I would recommend, yeah, if you're a postdoc, try the process out. And yeah, I think that's the end of my slideshow. And yeah, I'd be happy to chat more with you guys and answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Fan, a lot. Probably clap, and we can use the emojis to clap as well. Okay, and I'll stop the recording.